Hi there, my name's Adam Fielding, and welcome to another one of my streams. Well, that was an amazing introduction. I'm tripping over my words already. Fantastic. So this is going to be a kind of retrospective stream where I'm going to be looking at a few of the recent tracks I've written during my live streams. So yeah, there's some interesting ground to cover here. And I'll be taking questions via the chat if you're watching on Twitch, and generally just hope to have a bit of a chilled session. So if you missed it earlier this week, I did a stream with Ryan over on the Reason Studios channel on YouTube, and that was all kinds of fun. So if you watched that, one of these tunes will sound incredibly familiar because I covered that in quite a lot of detail during the Reason Studio stream. So you're going to be getting it again, but it's going to be a bit different. So just a bit of kind of background. What generally happens is when I'm doing these music making streams, I will create a tune from start to finish on stream, and then afterwards I'll kind of leave it until the following day. And the following day I'll come back and make a bunch of mix adjustments with fresh ears and kind of go from there. So these versions of the tracks are those versions that I've tweaked after the stream with a fresh pair of ears. What I'll be doing is I'll be explaining, kind of giving it more of a critical look, like things I would have done differently if I'd had a bit more time, things I've changed after the stream, that kind of thing. So seeing in the chat, yep, I've ruined the stream already. I've messed up the introduction, so why even bother at this point? This is a write-off. So amazing. Yeah, excellent. You'd think after doing this many streams I'd be able to say my name and explain what I'm doing, but evidently not. So yeah, so that's my plan for this stream. So again, if you have any questions or if there's anything you'd like me to cover in greater detail, if you're watching on Twitch, then feel free to ask via the chat. If you're watching on YouTube, then just comment away and I'll try and get back to you. And already the chat are piling on the sweet little sound effects there. So that is one thing I'm working on. I'm planning on adding some more sound effects and something to spend your points on in the Twitch chat. So that is, but that's a whole other thing. Not for today, maybe for next week. So all right, so the first track I'm going to be dipping into is this track called Chiroptera, which is awkwardly titled. But it was kind of a dark techno-y track. And oddly enough, it's quite a lengthy track, and I'm really happy with how this one turned out. I think the atmosphere was it's very much something I've been wanting to do for quite a while, and it was really nice to have the chat helping me out while I was doing this. So it is, and it's also got the dubious honor of being the first track that I think I've ever written that was over 10 minutes in length. So the fact that I did that in a couple of hours on the stream is pretty amusing. So yeah, so there we go. So I'm just going to play this track from start to finish, and I'll be keeping an eye on the chat in the meantime. And if there's anything you'd like to ask me, then please fire away and I will go through it. Digital Burnout has just asked a very good question. Do you have the live stream version and then the tweaked version to compare? So I do still have all of the original project files. I just haven't got them open at the moment, and they're kind of tucked away. So one of these days, I feel like that would be a really good thing to do, would be to kind of compare the original version against the tweaked version. But essentially, a lot of the tweaks I've made in the tweaked version are things that are really obvious when I listen back to it with a fresh pair of ears. So it's not, I generally don't tend to make that many arrangement changes, although I have in one of these tracks, which I'll get into. But generally speaking, Tony Burns asked, what happens if we do the save reminder in one of these review streams? I don't know, not a lot, I guess. So, Club Must Ask, did I hear that right? Is this the first track you've ever written that's over 10 minutes, not just on stream? I'm sure you've done a 10-minute track before this. Not to my knowledge. I don't think I have. I could be wrong. I'll have to do some research into that, but I don't think I have. I think I've sort of got around the 9-minute mark before, but I don't think I've done one that's over 10 minutes, outside of kind of hardware jams and stuff like that. But I don't know. I'll have to look into that. Anyway, so without further ado, this is Chiroptera, which is a track I wrote on the 10th of September, if this date is anything to go by. So I'll just play that and keep my mouth shut, and hope you enjoy. Cheers. So yeah, that was Chiroptera, which yeah, it's really interesting because I had some fantastic advice while I was working on that via the chat, basically telling me to let it take its time and let it breathe and do its own thing. I think my favorite comment was from Buskin Bills, who was giving me loads of really excellent arrangement advice about just basically, if you think something should change, take something out, don't add stuff. It was giving me fantastic advice while I was working on this, and that's kind of how it ended up ballooning to sort of over 10 minutes or so. And then right at the end of the stream, he said, actually, well, I mean, it's good, but I'm not massively into dark techno, which I thought was just hilarious. He's given me this excellent advice during the stream, and then that was just such a great way to finish the stream. It's like, here's all this great advice I've been giving you, but actually I'm not really into this genre. It was so good. I loved it. That's one of my favorite streaming moments so far. I loved it. So just going through a bunch of comments. So yeah, noticed a few people posting while the track was playing. So Clubmat says, you owe Bills that disco track now. We don't use the D word. Clubmat also said, this track makes me think of being on the motorway in the middle of the night in a heavy storm, which I can totally get behind. It's got that kind of that feel to it. Interestingly enough, I did, like the big narcissist I am, I listened to this while I went for a run shortly after I wrote it, and as I was playing it, sort of some really heavy clouds rolled in, and it got really, like, everything got quite dark and quite intense. The wind picked up, and I was like, oh, this is pretty cool. And then, but as soon as the track finished, the skies opened and the sun started shining. It was really bizarre. So, Ty Blue says, love that Europa bass line. Yeah, so that's a bass patch, I believe, from Europa Relay. So, oh, of course, it's filtered out at the moment, so... Yeah, I really like that patch. I think it fits particularly well in this track. So if you like that one and you want some more excellent Europa patches, check out my refill called Europa Relay. It's full of excellent patches like that. So excellent. I managed to sneak in a plug there. Jalik asked, would you ever be willing to kind of go in depth with the Electro Panda evolution? I've been taking a hard look at it of late. So that's really interesting. So I have actually used an instance of evolution in this track for something I would say it's not very typical use of evolution. I'm basically using it to trigger an instance of stutter edit, which I've had to put inside a combinator because you can't attach players directly to effects devices in Reason. So I've had to stick it in a combinator and then tell the combinator to tell the stutter edit to receive notes, and then stick the evolution on that. So it just kind of plays along and just triggers effects as the track's playing. False Mirror Music says, there's nothing narcissistic about enjoying your own tracks. That's what we make it for, isn't it? You are correct. It's really interesting because I used to be very kind of more conscious about listening to my own music when I was first starting out, and I used to think it was kind of like, I say narcissistic. I was being a bit jokey there, obviously, but I did used to think it was like, why would you listen to your own music? Like it's just a bit weird. You don't do that. Nowadays I listen to my music all the time. I write the kind of music I would like to listen to. That's sort of the point. Tony Byrne, when no one else enjoys them. Wow. Don't be so hard on yourself. I'm sure that's not true. So I should use evolution more. It's excellent. I've just kind of used it in a bit of an unorthodox way here. And Tony Byrne also said, I have to admit that the last 4 tracks have been some of my favorites from the streams. I played this one a lot. So yeah, I feel like I kind of hit a good thing with the past few tracks in particular. I've really liked all of them, and I feel like I've kind of gone in a nice direction here. And yeah, it's been really satisfying to work on. So I did have a break before the most recent track that I wrote on stream, just because the week before I really wasn't feeling it in terms of writing music for a stream. And instead of putting on a really lackluster stream, I just thought I'll take this opportunity to kind of recharge my batteries and come back the following week with something good. And I'm glad that paid off, because it would have been really embarrassing if I'd come back the following week and just rolled out a dirge. So Ned the Ted says, I use your Europa Relay a lot. Love it. Excellent. Thank you. I'm glad you like it. Digital Burner also says, I would love to know more about that bass. It's sitting perfectly in the mix so far. So the main drone kind of bass is a Respire patch, which is sat here nicely. So I'm just going to solo that and play a little bit here. So interestingly enough, I thought I'd had this going through a saturation knob or something, but it turns out that's just how it sounds. So yeah, this is actually just a preset that comes with Spire. It's a really, really nice patch. So if you have Spire or Respire, then do check it out, because it's one of those ones that I keep turning to, and it's incredibly useful. So the only processing I've done really is I've stuck it through a pump to kind of give it that pumping effect. So if I turn it off, it would just be a very simple drone. Yeah, it's just a really satisfying bass drone sound. It's really good. It's kind of, like I said, it's kind of become one of my go-tos. And yeah, if you're inspired, check it out. It's definitely a good starting point. I don't really think I changed anything there. So yes, Digical says, listing on my monitors in a treated room for the stream, and the stereo placement is excellent. That's awesome. Thank you so much. And what's particularly interesting about that is the fact that I wrote most of the track using headphones, and I'm going to go through the changes that I made after the fact in just a second, after I cover a couple of things. But yeah, it's just that, generally speaking, when I do a stream, after a couple of hours of listening on headphones, it's kind of hard to know what sounds right and what doesn't. So I do need that break so I can come back to it the following day and listen on monitors and be like, okay, I can immediately pick out things that don't sound right. It's normally things like that snare is too loud, or that clap is too harsh, or things like that, which I tend to gloss over when I do these streams, just because it's not a particularly interesting thing to talk about if it's something was a little too loud, so I turned it down. It's like, it's not rocket science. So so I was going to talk about, this is the first time I used a particular synth called Pendulate. So if I can find that, it's up here. So I did actually I did open it up while the track was playing, and I came a bit unstuck, because I do have 3 projects open at the moment, and apparently that was the tipping point at which my computer started crackling slightly. I think it's just because of the graphics. But yeah, so I used this as an ARP, and I really like how it sounds in this track. So I'm just going to solo that for a second, if I can find it. So yeah, it's a really, really nice synth, and I particularly like it. You probably heard a little bit of popping there. For some reason, this runs perfectly when I'm not on stream. I think it's because my video card is also being used to encode the video for the stream, and this uses OpenGL, so it's probably struggling a little bit there. But you know, whatever. But yeah, it's always refreshing to use a synth that doesn't follow sort of typical subtractive synth or wavetable synthesis tradition. So it's nice that this brings something a bit different to the table. I feel like at this point I have loads of VAs and loads of wavetable synths and stuff like that. So when I first started using this, I was like, oh, this is really cool and something different. And if you haven't used this, Pendulate is free. There is a kind of bigger brother version called Generate, which I've started using recently, and that's awesome. I love it to bits. It's great for sort of atmospheric sounds, and just you can get some really interesting chaotic sounds that sound, you know, nice and musically interesting. So it's excellent. So right, so I'm going to talk about Jalix just asked, that's a great sound. Have you checked out Generate, and if so, what are your thoughts? I think it's excellent, and if you like Pendulate, I would very much. So Digital Burnout said, can we hear Pendulate in the mix again? I'll get to that in a second. But yeah, Generate is fantastic. It's basically Pendulate on steroids. So if you like Pendulate, you will definitely like Generate. It very much feels like they saved, like Pendulate's good on its own, but they saved the special sauce for Generate. The effects section is fantastic. The fact that there's several different oscillator types, and it's incredibly versatile. And the thing I like about it is it has this kind of chaotic, unpredictable nature to it, but it sounds musically really interesting and useful. Like, anyone can create a noise that doesn't really fit in the mix. But the reason I like Generate because it's musically very interesting and just fun to play around with. So yeah, I'll just play a bit of the track with Pendulate so you can actually hear it. So yeah, it's just I'd really like how that sounds, and I think I ended up automating the chaos shape on Pendulate, so that's kind of what causes that shift in sound as it's playing. It's really nice. So what did I change in this track after I finished writing it? So I've got a nice little list of things that I changed after the stream. So the first of which is I adjusted the levels and I basically brought it up so it was kind of in line with a bunch of all of my other live stream tunes. So what that generally tends to entail is it's really, really not particularly scientific. I'll bring it up until it sounds about as loud as some of the other live stream tunes I've written, and I tend to give kind of the input gain a 4.5 bump on this output maximizer, which is the last thing that the actual audio will hit before hitting the sound card. So what I'll do is I'll basically just bring the levels up until the limiter is just kicking in on the input, which you'll be able to see by the lights on the gain meter here. So if I press play on a busier part of the track, you'll be able to just see that sort of just kicking in. Or not. Oh, there we go. So it's just kicking in there. I tend to find that tends to be kind of a good starting point. It's because I'm using a lot of very familiar techniques when I'm putting these tracks together in terms of controlling like transients and stuff like that. So I have a limiter on the drums and very, very kind of similar techniques that I use. So that basically means that's kind of a good reference point, and from there I tend to just apply a straight up 3 dB gain. And that's it. That is my mastering on these tracks. So I've been working on a bunch of tracks to release as a live stream album at some point. So it's the first 12 tracks I wrote during these sessions this year. And the mastering process for that is much more involved. And I did kind of go into that a little bit in a previous stream, but for the purposes of these streams, I like to keep things simple. I don't want to overdo things. It's a very easy way to ruin a mix is by just slathering it with unnecessary effects on the output bus. So I tend to just keep things simple, especially with these stream tracks. And if it needs anything beyond a bit of a bump on the output, then I should probably just fix it in the mix. So what that generally tends to mean is I have mixes that I'm quite happy with by the time I actually come around to remixing anything or mastering it properly, which is a great place to be. So another thing I did is I bounced a couple of channels to audio. So originally I had a, what was it called? There's a particular channel here, which is like this sort of pulsing kind of sound. Here we go. It's called Pulse. Just ignore the hi-hats. So originally that was an instance of Massive, which I was using with a patch that was in one of my Fielding Soundworks banks, and I for some reason I bounced it. I'm not entirely sure why. I think it wasn't particularly CPU intensive or anything like that. So yeah, I'm just gonna play that for a sec. Yeah, so Tiny Bone says, will the running order be chronological or otherwise? It will be chronological. So this is the first one. The next track I cover will be Liminal Sequence, and then I'll be covering Pulling the Thread, which is the most recent track I've written during these streams. So yeah, so that's pretty much all I changed in terms of just general levels. I think I turned up the vocal washers, which come in during the track. So that's this little chappy here. If I just solo that. because I think originally they were much further back in the mix, and when they come in, you know, I feel like with everything that's going on in this track, there aren't that many channels for a track that's sort of 10 minutes long. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 channels, so very kind of reserved for something that's so lengthy. But yeah, I think there was enough going on to maintain interest and just kind of give everything this sort of hypnotic vibe. But yeah, I boosted the vocal washes and I turned down the closed hats, which were just playing, because I think originally it's hats in particular are one of those things that I don't tend to notice during a stream. It's one of those things I notice afterwards if they're too loud. I'll listen back the following day and just be like, oh, those are way too harsh. Let's just dial those back a bit. Tony Burns asked, sorry, I actually meant the running order of the album. So yes, it's in chronological order. Originally, I had played with the idea of keeping things clustered together thematically. So having some down-tempo tracks and stuff like that. But I just had everything queued up in chronological order and played it back. And I really liked it as kind of, both in terms of the flow of the actual tracks themselves and also just as a concept. I like the idea of it being a snapshot into this year, essentially. I mean, let's be honest, this year has been kind of weird, and it's really, really cool to have a sort of musical document that I created in front of you guys. And I think changing the track order might sort of compromise that idea a little bit, so I thought I'd just leave it as it was. And I've grown quite accustomed to the flow of it now, which is quite interesting. It is kind of jarring to start the track on Quarantine, which is a generative-ish track. And yeah, from that point onwards, it kind of, things pick up and get a bit lighter. But also, I really regret calling the first track Quarantine. It's such a cliched thing to have done. But never mind, it's done. And again, it's very emblematic of the era in which it was written, because, you know, Quarantine had started. So there we go. So yeah, in terms of other changes I made, I boosted, there was another channel which is called Organic Percussion, which is this thing here, it was just a loop I had in my sample library. So that was just a loop which I ended up putting through a DR1, and in the original version of the track that was going through an instance of Beatformer, which is a wonderful, wonderful VST effect, and I'm just going to bring that out now because I use it on pretty much everything nowadays. So interestingly, I picked this up in a bundle with a couple of other effects by Acusonus, or instruments rather, and I expected this to be the thing I used the least. It was like, it's included in the bundle, I'm not really going to use it a whole lot, but it is by far the thing I've been using the most, and it's really, really cool. So the thing I tend to use it the most for is this squash knob here, squash knob. So when you dial it up, it kind of has this sort of more compressed kind of sound. Really kind of heavy compression, but when you turn it down, it introduces a kind of sort of gated, expanded kind of sound. So it just makes things sound much more poppy, like that. So I've just dialed it right back, and it just sounds incredibly poppy. I'm not entirely exactly certain what it's doing. It sounds like an expander and gate combination to me. But like I said, just at the start of the stream, I whacked this on my vocal setup for these streams because I was curious as to what it would do. And it works really nicely, I think. So that was cool. Just had a comment in the chat from Digital Burner saying, possible talking points, bass is really good in this track. Could we touch how and where you used reverb, e.g. which sounds receive reverb and where it's applied, sends or inserts? So this is a really interesting topic, and yeah, so this is a good chance for me to talk about my favorite device in Reason at the moment, which is the DR1. I'm kind of addicted to this reverb. So it's on pretty much everything in this track, I'm not gonna lie. So you may have noticed I've only really used one aux send in this track, and that's the tail reverb pump, which comes in a couple of parts of the track. So I'm going to try and find one of those now so you can hear it. Where is it? I think there's one here. So yeah, so as this section progresses, I'm feeding the drums more and more into this tail reverb pump, which is literally just it's just a DR1 going through an instance of pump, and that's it. It's just a reverb, basically. In other versions, sort of since this track, I've actually been doing something quite similar in some other tracks. I tend to put it through a high-pass filter just to kind of completely roll out the lows. So yeah, Fusion9903 says, man, this has been the longest 5-minute dip I've ever witnessed. Is he coming back today? I hope that's just Fusion9903, and I am still here for everyone. So yeah. But basically, yeah, so it's just a reverb. So the reason I've used this as an aux send is because I want it to be applied on top of everything else that's going on. I don't want it to affect the actual sound of the drums. I just want the drums to go through it and for this extra effect to be applied on top of it. Now, I used to use aux sends all the time for reverb, so it's nice to have kind of a couple of aux sends that you can just have in the track at any time and just use that to kind of, it's like your standard room reverb, or have something a bit more atmospheric and just feed things through it as and when you need them. So yeah, but I've stopped using aux sends as much because I just find it more convenient to just whack a reverb on as an insert and then just control it per channel, and it also makes organizing stems much easier. So I've become much more organized in terms of storing stems and stuff like that over the past couple of years. And having the reverb baked into the track itself just makes it much easier, instead of just having one aux send channel, which is all of the reverb mushed together. If you have all the aux sends on one channel, if you then decide to make a change to the rest of the stems, you're kind of messing with the reverb and it's not going to match the rest of the track. Whereas if you have it baked into the track, any changes you make to that particular track are going to follow. It just makes more sense in that regard, and it's kind of, I find it more useful from an organizational perspective, but your mileage may vary. But yeah, in this instance, I was like, well, this is kind of, I'm just using that aux send for this one particular instance, and that's kind of why I kept it. So that's kind of its own channel doing that particular effect. But I'm just going to play this section so you can hear the effect and stop waffling on about it. So what's going on there is that I'm increasing the high-pass filter frequency on the drum, so it kind of loses all of the low end, and then it goes through that reverb to kind of create a sort of semi-noise riser kind of effect without actually using any other instruments. And that's kind of a neat technique that I've been using quite a bit recently as well for similar sort of situations. Tony Byrne has asked, this came up last week, is there really any difference between a genuine aux send than an insert with a dry wet encoder? It's fine, you can say knob, it's fine. Yeah, so another thing I really like using insert effects for is, especially reverb, is the fact that if you dial it over 50%, so if we say 50% there, once you hit that 50% mark, you're getting equal amounts of the dry signal and the reverb signal kind of being mixed together. Once you go over that point, you get more of the wet signal and less of the dry signal. So you're essentially kind of smearing the sound, which I use all the time. Like it's really good for kind of just creating more atmospheric washes and that kind of thing. So I'm trying to think if there's an example of that in this particular track. I think a lot of these are dialed quite far back. So my approach to reverb in this track was, there's not really that much going on in terms of the number of elements playing at once. Let's fill out the space with reverb, but kind of keep it dialed back a bit. So even on that kind of extra bassline thing, it's got quite a bit of reverb on top, but that's a 3-second reverb, but it's dialed in at about 31%. So it's, in the context of the mix, it's just helping to fill out the space a little bit there. And it's just really useful. So I'm just checking the comments again. False Mirror Music has said, I'm having this probably weird approach of keeping every sound inside a combinator, including effects, so I can easily store an instrument with its effects as a patch. That's not a bad idea at all. I think that's a very solid approach. I mean, that's kind of what the combinator's for. So yeah, it's a totally justifiable thing. I've started using I tend to use the insert section, the SSL channels more and more these days. Unless I have a very specific reason for not doing that. I can't think of any off the top of my head, except for this weird stutter edit thing, which I had to keep in a separate combinator to actually use it. But yeah, so that's kind of one instance where I'd say using an insert is more creatively interesting, because you can use it as more of a creative effect to completely smear the sound. So just as an example, if I think towards the end of the track as well, I do actually dial up the reverb on a lot of elements. So if I can just find something here. Oh, so there's an RV, yeah, here we go. So the save reminder has just gone off. Excellent. Yeah, so I won't be saving anything this week. Surprise, surprise. So yeah, I've actually got the drum channels going through a DR1, and at the end of the track, that I just basically crank up the dry wet knob so that it just basically, instead of hearing the individual drum hits, it just becomes a smeared out mess. So I'm just going to actually solo the drum channel again there and just play that. So it's just that individual clicky sound at the end. So it's becoming less and less focused on the transient itself and becoming more and more focused on just this kind of swishy sound that's just filling out the end. And you can't do that with an aux send. If you were doing that with an aux send, you'd have to essentially reduce the volume of the track as you're increasing the reverb, or use the pre-fade option on the aux sends, which you can use here on the SSL mixer. So yeah, so that's that. That's kind of my approach to reverb. Reverb was on everything in this track. It was all DR1 because I love the DR1, and not that the RB7000 is going to get some love in a second, but yeah. So that was kind of interesting. So I feel like, again, I'm just going to highlight this for anyone who missed it during the actual stream. If I just unsolo that. So there's this weird kind of glitchy percussion that plays throughout. So basically, that is just kind of a nice and simple sort of percussive element. So I'm going to turn off stutter edit so you can hear it without any stutters. I can't actually remember where that sound came from. I think it was just a sample that I had lying around. And so what I've done is I've just fed it through stutter edit 2, which is you control using MIDI notes. So every time a MIDI note triggers the effect, it will trigger a different stuttery effect, a different gesture, as they're called in stutter edit. So all I did was I wanted to attach an instance of evolution to stutter edit, because then it would just be constantly feeding it a steady stream of notes that I could restrict to a particular range. I'd just be getting constant variations on glitchy effects. And I realized very quickly that you can't attach players to effects devices in Reason. It just doesn't work. So one way to get around that was to just put the stutter edit inside a combinator, select it in the programmer in the combinator, make sure receive notes is turned on, and then attach the evolution to the combinator, and that gets around the problem. So if you've experienced something similar where you're using an effect that requires MIDI input to actually work and you want to use a player with it, that's a nice way around it. I'm not entirely sure why you can't attach players to effects in Reason. I guess it's more of a niche thing, really. Not that many effects in Reason require MIDI input. So yeah, so that was that. So a couple of other things. So one device I tend to use a lot in my tracks is the MP5. And it's just I find it very, very musically pleasing to use. And I tend to find kind of the sweet spots, especially when I'm working with highs, which I've kind of done here, is to set the high boost to 12K. That's kind of a nice sort of sweet spot to make everything kind of pop a little bit. But if things are sounding a bit too harsh, then you can kind of attenuate everything around 20K. It kind of helps to give everything a smoother sound in the highs. So I'm just going to solo the drums as they are and maybe play a bit sort of more towards the middle of the track and kind of mess around with that, and you might be able to hear the difference. So if I just disable that, so it just sounds a bit has a bit less life to it. So I really, really like it because it's just kind of one of those set it and forget it. It's hard to kind of it's hard to do anything wrong when you're kind of just cutting the highs like that. It just sounds really, really nice. So that's kind of become my go-to EQ, just kind of making things pop or sit a little bit better. So I tend to use that on all of my drum inserts nowadays. So in the case of this track, I actually ended up turning up the 12K boost because originally it just needed a bit more pop to it. So I just turned that up and it kind of helped things to sort of pop a little bit. I turned up the 20K attenuation to compensate for that. So it's a really nice combination. It's kind of a bit of a balancing act to get those right. And it's really the kind of thing that I struggle to do when I'm wearing cans. So Yeah, so with the vocal washers, there I actually added an instance of the RE2A compressor, just kind of a quick and dirty sort of compression, just to kind of tame the levels as they're going into the rest of the insert section, which is this Neptune to give everything a form and shift, and this DR1 to just wash the vocals out. And yeah, that just made my life a little bit easier when mixing everything. Again, it's not something I really thought about when I was actually doing the stream itself, but listening back to it, I was like, oh, some of these, it could do with just a bit of sort of dynamic smoothing to sort that out. Unfortunately, you can't get the RE2A anymore. It is impossible to purchase a new copy, which is a shame because it's one of my favorite compressors in Reason at the moment. It's just kind of one of those things that I turn to on a pretty regular basis. So yeah, I've had it for years, and it's just a great compressor. I also ended up, something I didn't do during the actual stream itself was tidy up the vocal clips. So these were just a bit of a mess originally. There was just one continuous clip, so I've just split that into 3 separate clips and kind of given them some little fades and given them a bit of a trim to clean things up a bit. It's the kind of thing I don't tend to worry about when I'm actually doing a stream. So it just helps to clean the mix up a bit. So something else I did as well was, this is I think the last thing I changed in this particular track, was in the ARP, I actually added an instance of pulsar. So originally the ARP was just kind of panned dead center. There wasn't really any width to it outside of that provided by the reverb. And I thought it'd be kind of cool to have it sort of swoosh a bit around the stereo field for the listener. So if I solo that, you might be able to hear that slightly. So it's going over to the left now. Now over to the right. Okay, so there is some extra width being provided by the echo because I got ping pong turned on there, so that's kind of giving it quite a bit of stereo width as well. But what the pulsar's doing here is I've routed one of the CV outputs to the panning input on the back of the ARP and just dialed that in a bit, and it just kind of swishes around a bit. So I really like using the pulsar for little effects like that. Something I actually brought up during the Reason Studio stream earlier in the week was the fact that it's kind of on the back of the redrum, which I tend to prefer using over most other drum machines in Reason. I'm not entirely sure why, it's just kind of, I think it's force of habit at this point, but on the back of the redrum, there is a pitch CV input on every single channel. So if you want to introduce a bit of pitch variation, you can just fire up an instance of pulsar and just hook that up to the pitch CV input on the back. Maybe not have it like a super obvious effect, but just kind of dial it back a bit, and you kind of end up with some more kind of pitch drift, maybe slow it down a bit, use a sample and hold LFO instead to kind of provide some randomness. So yeah, it's incredibly useful, and I'm very surprised I haven't actually done that during any of these streams. But it's one of those effects that you shouldn't really be able to notice as a listener. It's one of those things that you shouldn't really notice consciously. But I feel like this kind of thing sort of filters its way into your subconscious when you're listening to it. And I think in a track like this, that would have actually been quite useful. So lesson learned. I also increased the reverb on the ARP as well, just because there wasn't enough reverb, and I'm a sucker for reverb. And also I added some of those aux send triggers for some extra kind of reverb tails during the track. So that reverb that I'm using on the drums, I also decided to apply to the ARP. So if I look in the sequencer for the actual entire song itself, I believe there should be a couple of instances of the ARP where you'll be able to see, so there's a couple of instances it's in the block itself where it's just triggering that extra reverb. So if I just play that, you'll be able to hear kind of these reverb washes coming in around here. It's not super obvious, but I'm just going to play that. So it just kind of adds this extra kind of touch to the mix, just to kind of help to fill it out a little bit. So yeah. Travis just said just did a big old the Echo instance today with lots of ping pong. I love the Echo. Like it's one thing I've really kind of learned from these streams is that I sort of took it a bit for granted, and I actually really like I love Valhalla delay. Like it's an awesome delay unit, and I use that. They like Valhalla delay and the Echo have very different characteristics, and they both provide different washers, and they're just both excellent devices. But the Echo is definitely no slouch. And Travis also points out that the offset knob on the Echo is instant huge width, and I agree. And it's something that I actually again don't tend to use anywhere near often enough for some reason. So yeah, so the offset knob, which is here, you just turn that up and it just kind of you can use that to kind of provide a bit of extra sort of width. It just increases the time on each ping pong note, which is super useful. So yeah, that's really neat. It'd be nice if you could disable sync on just the offset and have the sync on the time. I think that's something that I quite like about Valhalla delay, as well as the offset isn't tied to the tempo of the track, even if you have sync turned on. But you know, different approaches, and the Echo's awesome. Use it. So yeah, that's pretty much everything I changed in this track. So that was quite a lengthy one. But sort of looking at it from a more critical perspective, like one thing I fully expected to happen when I came back to this track the following day was I was expecting to listen to it the following day and be like, wow, this is way too long and it does not maintain my interest whatsoever. So imagine my surprise when I listened back to it and realized, hey, I'm really happy with this track. Yeah, I was really happy with how this turned out, and it kind of scratched a very particular creative itch that I'd been wanting to address for quite a while. Like, I've wanted to do something with a sort of dark techno-y flavor to it, and it's really neat that I was able to do that on stream in front of you guys, because it's not a genre I tend to dabble in particularly often. And it was great to also hit that 10-minute mark during a stream as well. That was kind of a nice personal milestone accomplished. So if you're watching that particular stream and you are helping me out along the way, thank you so much for your creative input. And yeah, I really enjoyed that one. So I'm generally very happy with how the mix and everything's turned out, just in general, really. So that was Chiroptera. So now I'm going to go on to the much less creatively titled Liminal Sequence, which I also covered during the Reason Studio stream earlier this week. And for anyone who's unaware, this entire track was written using nothing but stock devices in Reason, most of which are pre-Reason 6, except for the beat map. That kind of sticks out a bit. But that was, as was mentioned in the stream earlier in the week, that was kind of a nice case of kind of old meets new. So Redrum is from Reason 1. We've got the beat map, which is from Reason 11. Then we've got a bunch of Thors as for percussion from Reason 4. Reason Thor hit. So yeah, it's there's a lot going on here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to play the track for you, and I hope you enjoy it. So here we go. I'm just going to keep quiet and play the track. So yeah, that was Liminal Sequence, which I really, really enjoyed working on that track. There's a couple of comments saying that I was getting DR1 withdrawal. So yes, this was written entirely using stock components in Reason, which meant I couldn't use the DR1, so I had to use the RV7000 on everything instead, substituting one for the other. But every time I create an instance of the RV7000, I would instinctively go towards the Synapse Audio section of my effects list. So yes, someone has pointed out, Digital Burnout said, I see some Tom P in there. And yes, there are a lot of instruments from Tom Pritchard in this particular track. So for anyone who's unaware, this is going to be your regularly scheduled Tom Pritchard promotion hour. So yes, I basically, just before I created this track in Reason, Tom Pritchard very kindly released all of his earlier Tom Pritchard sound design refills for free. And so I thought it'd be really, really cool to use a load of his patches during this particular stream. And I'm positive I'm going to be dipping into those patches again during future streams, because how could I not? They still sound fantastic. Someone described them as being evergreen, which I think is a really wonderful way of putting it. So I used a whole load of Tom's patches in this particular track. I don't have a link for those patches on me at the moment, but I'll just put a link to his Twitter feed in the chat, so if anyone wants to check that out, they can go there, and I think there's a pinned tweet at the top which has the link. Clobmut is pasting a direct link to the tweet, so there we go. It's solved. So yeah, it was really, really cool, and I didn't really use any synths post Thor in this track. So no Europa, no Grain. It was really interesting. It kind of put me in a really nice Reason 4, Reason 5 mindset, oddly enough, which I also discussed during the Reason Studio stream earlier in the week. So this is actually one of those tunes where I listened back to it the following day and realized I want to make some tweaks to the arrangement here. And a lot of that was also guided by some of the comments that I had in the chat the previous night, where people were saying, oh, I really like the sound of the breakdown. It's really, really nice. Every time it played, people kept saying, this is a really wonderful breakdown. It's got a really nice atmosphere. And I listened to it the following day and I was like, yeah, you're right. And it's way too short at the moment. So originally this entire section was half the length that it is now. I basically just inserted some extra bars there and just extended the breakdown. So this whole section was half the length originally. And I just thought it was a really nice place to let the track breathe. And yeah, so everyone in the chat was absolutely right. That's a really nice part of the track, and it's interesting because the previous week I didn't have any problems with letting elements breathe. It was just, for some reason, I think I just kind of wanted to get things going along more quickly in this track, and I didn't let that breakdown breathe enough. So yeah, I did actually make a few more arrangement tweaks here as well. The fade originally was quite jarring, like it happened just a bit too suddenly. So originally, I think the fade started here right at the end, and I think now I've started the fade a bit earlier in the track, so it has a more natural fade out. So again, this is the kind of thing that I don't tend to notice when I'm actually working on the track itself. It's when you listen back and it just sounds really obvious. It's like, oh, it'd be really nice if that breakdown was longer, or oh, that fade out is a little bit awkward, maybe I could sort of tweak that. And I also changed after sort of around here, I think originally that was a different kind of block, so I changed that from, I think it was block 2 originally. I thought it'd be nice to kind of spice things up by going back to block 1, because we hadn't really seen any of that since the beginning of the track. So I had 3 blocks, and I was like, oh well, let's just bring that in. Tom has said, oh, so are we choosing the track name? No, because I've already finished this track. No, this is a Liminal Sequence from a few weeks back. So unfortunately, no naming of this track. This isn't a music making session this week. This is a going over existing tracks session. So yes, but I've really enjoyed sort of working on this track. And for anyone who actually missed the stream itself, the track itself started with this particular patch called Liminal Sequence, which Tom very kindly provided specifically for me to create a song around during a stream. And he actually sent this patch to me a little while ago, and I think I think that was around the time I decided to dip into jungle, and I realized that I hadn't actually, this particular track would not have worked in a jungle track. And then I left it a couple of weeks and then sort of found it again. And I was like, oh, holy crap, I haven't used this patch yet. I really should. And this was also around the time when Tom released all of his patches for free. And it just seemed like an apt time to combine the two, really. So this is the actual patch itself that plays throughout. It's a really, really nice patch. And one thing I mentioned during the Reason Studio stream is that I like the fact that I described it on a lot of his patches on that stream as sometimes being a bit simple, which I think is a bit of a misnomer. I think Ryan put it better. He said they're tastefully put together, which means, this is a single oscillator. It's like the oscillator section of this particular patch has a lot going on in the matrix section. It's not a particularly simple patch, but it's not overly complicated. Things aren't complicated for the sake of being clever and just being like, oh, look at how fancy this patch is. It's a really good, it's just a really nice patch and not overly complicated. So, yeah. So, Tom says, oh, I'm sorry, I was really missing all the latest news. Corona. Oh, that sucks. I'm really sorry to hear that. I hope you make a speedy recovery. Yeah, that sucks. Yeah, get well soon. So those were kind of the general arrangement tweaks I made. I increased the reverb at the end of the track, and I also added an ECF42, which I think I used to fade out the reverb at the end of the track. So that's just a very simple low pass filter, just so I could sort of essentially use it as a fade on the reverb. I like to use low pass filters as devices to help fade elements instead of always automating the volume of different elements and stuff like that. I'm not entirely sure when this habit started, but I think at this point it's kind of a part of my general workflow and process. So at the end of the track, it kind of I think it just kind of gets enveloped into that reverb. So again, I'm cranking up the dry wet on this particular RV7000, and it's just completely smushing the sound, which you wouldn't be able to do if this was a send effect. And then the decay's cranked up, but I'm using the ECF42 filter here to kind of dial it back and fade it out. So that's a nice combo. That's actually something that I used to do all the time when I was using the RV7000 in its heyday of like 2009 or so. So yeah, it's great. Art by Words has asked, how does the block affect the track? So that's an interesting question, because basically, so if you didn't actually watch me put any of these tracks together, they tend to follow a sort of pretty standard process in terms of putting them together and arranging them. So this particular track I created, well, let's just play one of these blocks. This is block one. The first thing I did when I put this track together was I created this block. This was the first thing I did before I actually wrote or arranged anything in the main sequencer. Wait, it helps if I unmute everything first. So that's quite a sizable portion of what's actually going on in the song. So when I created that block, I decided I'd want a couple of variations. So I actually just copied all of that and brought it over into block 2, and then just varied the chord progression slightly. So I'm just going to play that so you can hear what I'm talking about. So it's kind of a variation on block 1, and I created a third block which is essentially the same, but it's just one steady note throughout, so I could use that as an extra kind of more of a transitional block, I guess. So I had essentially an A block and a B block, which I could kind of switch in and out as the track progressed. And then from that point, I basically worked backwards. So I went to the song view and just brought block 1 in over at the start of the track, muted a load of elements. And, it's a really interesting way of working, because you know where the song is going to go, because you've already created the block that is the destination. You're kind of working backwards from there. and it's just a really interesting way of working. And as was pointed out earlier in the week during the Reason Studio stream, it's really interesting to separate the processes of sort of that more creative writing mindset of actually getting your ideas down and the arrangement process. They're two very different processes, and I think separating the two like this can actually be quite rewarding in terms of getting an idea down quickly. So once the ideas are in the blocks, like actually getting a tune arranged doesn't tend to take too long. So I think during these streams, I would say I average about an hour to get the blocks ready, and then about an hour to arrange everything and get all the automation ready. And if you look at one of the blocks, so like it actually looks quite sparse because I have all of these empty automation lanes. So when I create the original block itself, none of these automation lanes would be here. It's only when I go back and sort of unravel the block itself into the track, that's when I start adding the automation lanes and adding that extra movement. So yeah, so the blocks are doing a hell of a lot is the answer to that particular question. So yeah, I hope that helps. But yeah, it's a really interesting way of working, and it's particularly useful for getting an idea down quickly, which is sort of essential during a stream, because you don't want to watch me struggling with the same 8 bars without having a particular end goal in mind. It's nice to have that destination ready. So yeah, in terms of something else I actually added to this track were some really subtle pitch bends in the atmosphere. So there's this particular patch here called Table Ghost, which is from Tom Pritchard's Portals refill, I believe. And that kind of got smeared a bit using the RV7000 just to kind of give it less of a granular feel, I think. I think it had kind of a sort of granular texture to it. So I added some sort of subtle pitch bends, which just kind of gave it a more sinister feel. Okay, it helps if I can actually hear everything, so I'm just going to solo this channel. So it's not a super obvious pitch bend, but I just felt like listening back to this the following day, I thought that particular texture it just needed a bit of variation at certain points in the track just to kind of not stick out so much. I think I also brought it back in the track as well. So yeah, that's pretty much all I changed with the atmosphere there. With the bass, there's this bass compressor, which I added to the bass. So I added an M-class compressor to the bass because I just realized it just needed a bit of compression just to kind of help it sit a bit better in the mix. It sounded pretty solid beforehand, but I just thought just to help kind of tame it a little bit, I'll just add this M-class compressor. I think originally I was also planning on sidechaining the kick with the bass, but I didn't end up doing that in the end. So I just left that as it is. Actually, no, that's a lie. I actually used the SSL compressor to sidechain it with the bass. So if we solo the bass sound, you'll be able to hear it ducking where there should be kicks coming in. If I find a part that has bass. Oh, it's not soloed. Right, there we go. I'm picking the worst bits. So if we turn up the ratio, you'll be able to hear it more obviously. So every time a kick is playing, the bass is dipping, which is incredibly useful from a mix perspective. So what I wanted to do in this track, I didn't really want it to sound like it was being obviously ducked, so I just I dialed it in enough to kind of give me a bit of room in the mix. So there's only one of these LEDs lighting up when the kick is playing, which is enough for me. So it's only really something you notice when it's actually soloed, but it just gives me a bit of extra room when I'm actually playing around with the mix itself, and that's kind of vital, because one problem I did have in this track was with the drums the following day. So you may have noticed on the drum channel, so all of the drum hits are going through this section here, and I am whacking it through a massive maximizer gain, so that's a 9 dB gain there. Now you might be thinking, that's ridiculous, why are you sticking the drums through a 9 dB gain and then taking off like 6 dB. So essentially that's a 3 dB net gain at the end of that. So the reason I've done that is because there are a couple of parts in the track where I had some really tricky transients and I couldn't really figure out what was causing them. So this was very much a kind of sledgehammer to crack a walnut moment where I was just like, okay, I'll just apply a bit of a gain. The reason I've decided to leave it 3 dB gain is just so there's plenty of room for me to mess around with the drum levels in the mixer. So already that fade is riding quite high, even with the 3 dB gain. But I thought, you know, that's okay. There's still plenty of room for me to go up and down if I need to. But yeah, that seemed to do the trick. And one thing I did actually try, which I was looking for a second ago, is I might have done this in another track, but basically, when I've had issues with... So the way this track works is I have these drum sounds, which are essentially two layers. So I've got the sample layer and the Thor layer. So if I play the snare, that's a combination of a 909 snare sample and one of these awesome snare presets from Tom Pritchard. So if I just dial back the 909 sound, that's the sound of the Thor on its own. So when we bring in the 909, it just kind of helps to round out the snare sound. So when I was putting it together, I just thought, what would be a nice way to round out this snare? You can't really go wrong with a 909. So but the problem is, because they're both being triggered at the exact same time, you're basically compounding your problems with the transients. So you have two transients hitting at the exact same time, and I think that was kind of part of the problem I was having. So what I thought I had done, but evidently I haven't, was I thought I'd use the delay to just apply a very, 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 just a really, really, really light delay with zero feedback, just to kind of essentially shift the transient slightly without the listener being aware that it's actually being shifted. So if I play that, I'm curious as to how this will sound. If I just solo the drums. Here we go. Yeah, so I'm not entirely sure why... oh, it's not turned on. Okay, so it's not quite right. So yeah, I think I had issues with that, and in the end I couldn't be bothered to do it. But if you're using something like, if you're using sequence drums, you can use the groove mixer is a good way to do this. Is just apply a very slight slide to one of the channels, so you don't end up with both transients hitting at the same time. It's also a good approach if you have a kick playing at the same time as a snare. You don't want them both to hit at the literal exact same time. You can slide the note slightly, so it still sounds like it's in time, but both the transients are hitting at the literal the exact same moment, sort of. So you don't end up with as many peaks. But for this particular track, I just ended up sticking it through a gigantic maximizer because that seemed like the right thing to do. But I, to be honest with you, I think it kind of works in the context of this track, because they're nice rounded sounds. I didn't want there to be a super, super snappy in your face snare or anything like that. It just kind of, it works nicely, I think. So Tom has asked me, Adam, are you more of a person who browses presets and then edits them, or do you prefer to do it from scratch? Or for someone who would like to learn these things, is it better to start with a preset or just have fun with knobs, sliders? How did you start? So nowadays, first of all, I have no problem with using presets. If you find a preset and you're working on a track and it sounds great, then don't feel like you have to edit it for the sake of editing it. If it sounds great, just use it. At the end of the day, the people listening to your music are not going to sort of stand up and throw whatever they're listening to your music with out of the window and be like, I used a preset. So I think you'll be okay if you use presets. But if you want to get more into creating your own sounds and kind of giving sort of sounds your own character, starting with a preset and then modifying it is a perfectly viable way to go. Personally speaking, I kind of do a bit of both. I have a huge preset library, but it just so happens that a lot of those presets are ones that I have made. So I've kind of, as years have gone by, I've kind of separated the processes of creating sounds and writing music from each other. Every now and then I'll work on a tune and think, oh, I could do with a sound, and I'll just create it there and then. But a lot of the time I'll just dip into my own preset library. And even here, I'm using a ton of Tom sounds, because they sound fantastic. And I haven't really done a lot to them because I didn't need to do a lot to them because they already sound fantastic. So it's more a case of finding the sound that works for you, and whether that involves creating something from scratch or using something you've already got, that's entirely up to you. And I don't think there's, in terms of writing music and putting it together, there's nothing to be gained from creating everything from scratch unless you really want to. But yeah, it seems to be a recurring thing where you get people say, oh, well, I prefer to create everything from scratch because if you don't do that, then you're not writing real music. And it's like, if you play guitar, did you make your guitar? Yeah. So, it's a bit of a nonsense argument. Just write good music. So, No Sonic Limit says, if it sounds good, it is good. Excellent. That is an excellent quote, and I use that quite a lot. Mitch Mood says, how do you name your presets to help you identify the sound for when looking later? So I have a very, very inelegant solution to this. If I go into my particular, I basically have a big old patch library folder, And it is literally just a big list of presets from all various devices. So I have Amb for ambient patches, and BS for bass patches, and chords, keys, leads, pads, percussion, and sequences, and that's it. That's pretty much all my organization. So when it comes to samples, I actually adopt a slightly more modular approach to categorizing everything. So I have everything sort of drums, effects, guitars, melodic noise, percussion, vocals, and then those are kind of broken into further categories, and everything's tempo matched, so I can just drop it into a project and not have to worry about whether my project is the correct tempo or anything like that. So if I just dip into actually, if I go into the percussion folder, this is one that I tend to use quite a lot. Organic electronics. So this is all just a bunch of loops. I put the tempo at the start and then just the title of the patch afterwards. So it works for me, basically. It means I can dip into my sample library. I know what I pull out is going to sound really good, and maybe sort of need to tweak it a bit and kind of make it my own in that regard. But I feel like sort of it's categorized in order of the important information. The first thing you need to know is what kind of sound is it. Then the second thing you need to know is what is the tempo. Then the third thing you need to know is a general description of what it is. Obviously, this isn't necessarily a problem with presets because there isn't tempo data included in that. So yeah. It's kind of a different approach, but in terms of my presets, it's just a mess. It's just a mess of sounds. But I tend to just kind of go through. I also have them sorted by device. So if I say I want something with the character of Europa, I'll just dip into my Europa folder and pick something from there. And this it's true of everything else that I use, really. So yeah, Tony Bone says, imagine if classical composers had to prepare the piano before they could release their piece. Yeah, it's a weird argument. I've never really understood it. I feel like there's something to be said if you're constructing all of your music entirely from pre-made loops or something like that and not doing anything to them. But yeah, it's an odd argument. Just as long as you're writing good music and you're adding your own flair to it, then I don't really see the problem. So in terms of the actual percussion itself, other things I changed was this closed hat that kind of plays throughout. Originally, I think that was quite a bit longer. And I think in the context of the mix, I just needed to trim that a bit, although it sounds like it's quite short as it is, so I'm not entirely sure that did a lot. I also turned up the Thor percussion just generally. I think there's this percussive element here, which is that thing, which I really, really like. I really like that sound, and it was kind of buried in the background originally, so I just brought that up in the mix. And yeah, that's pretty much all I did, really. I also automated some of the stuff on the beat map, and then I bounced that to a sequencer lane just so it was kind of there, and I didn't have to worry about the beat map kind of maybe getting out of sync, because it sometimes does that. But yeah, I automated more of the elements on the beat map just to kind of give things a bit more variation. That's one of the real strengths of beat map, is the fact that you can just automate the density of individual things. Instead of kind of going in and having to start sort of adding and removing elements manually. It just means you can sit down and write music quicker. So yeah, it's a bit more of that. And yeah, that's pretty much it, really. I also automated the decay of the kick, of this Thor kick, at the start of the track. So that's the Thor kick. So originally at the start of the track, that kind of came in quite suddenly and was a bit sort of, oh, it's a bit weighty. So I just automated that so it's a more smooth fade in there. So if I just solo this section here, you can kind of hear that sort of kick tail increasing as it goes on. So it's just kind of filling out the lows more as that section progresses, which is nice. I really like that. So a couple of other things as well. There's this AHH loop, which is from the factory sound bank, which I can't remember which one it is, but so originally that didn't have any kind of high pass filter on it, and I think it was kind of muddying up the lows a bit, so I just stuck it through a high pass filter, set that to about 90 hertz, just so it completely scoops out the sort of sub frequencies and wasn't clashing with everything else that was going on. Again, that's not something I noticed at all when I was wearing cans, but the following day when I was listening back to it, I was like, oh yeah, that's making everything sound really muddy, so I just cleaned that up a bit. So yeah, so also in terms of the chord stab, so that's this particular thingy here. Um, so originally I think it was more narrow than it is now. So I think I had the ping pong sort of set more towards the center. And I decided I really wanted a sort of wide delay sound, so I just increased that, just turned it slightly more to the left. Oddly enough, I'm not entirely sure why I always go to the left first when I'm using ping pong delay. It's just one of those things. And also added another feedback wash kind of later in the track as well, just because I really like the sound of that feedback wash. So that's this thing here. So it just kind of rings out a bit longer. Clodmutt says, I reckon it's because we read left to right. That would make sense. That's as good a reason as any. It just feels weird to me if I have a delay going right first and then to the left. It's just weird. I don't like it. Art by Words asks, I was looking for a 12-string guitar sound. Do you have experience with any good sources? Not really, unfortunately. I don't tend to use 12-string guitars at all in my music, really. If I'm using sampled guitars, if I want like a quick acoustic guitar, like a rhythm acoustic guitar or something, and I can't be bothered to record it myself, I'll use Strummed Acoustic, which is the Native Instruments contact library that comes with Complete. That's a pretty good one. So yeah, just thinking, I think that's pretty much all I changed in this track, to be honest. So it was like not a lot of really obvious mix tweaks. It's just kind of I think it's the same with all of these tracks. It's kind of all of these little tweaks come together to make the track just generally sound more rounded and how I want it to sound. And a lot of this is stuff that is only really apparent when I come back to it the following day. So things like, turning down the hats and adding extra elements here and there. It's stuff that I don't really tend to notice when I'm actually working on the track itself. But yeah, it was really, really nice to work on that track and just kind of get back into that mindset of using all those older devices. And I think it was really, really nice that I was able to bring out the that's a particular, there we go, that's the reverb there, the RV7. So an interesting thing about the Red devices is they are, for the most part, they're mono devices. So even if you feed it with a stereo input, that input will be treated as a mono signal. So even though this will be outputting a stereo reverb, it's inputting essentially a mono sound, which isn't a problem because in this particular instance, I didn't really need a lot of stereo width on the input of that particular reverb, but it's something to bear in mind if you're using these effects. So yeah, just be a little careful. So right, with that in mind, unless anyone has any particular questions about this track, I'm going to move on to the next and final one today, which is Pulling the Thread from last week, which is a track I'm really, really happy with. Redline1715 says, Hi, Adam and Co. I heard your track on the Reza Studios live stream the other day. Great stream, by the way. And as Ryan pointed out on there, I'm also liking the use of using synths as drums. It's really cool, and it's something I fully intend to do more of myself. That combination is really, really, really useful. It's kind of the best of both worlds, really. You get the flexibility and variation of using synth drums and kind of the reliability of using samples. It's just a really nice way to work. And also, if you're combining two different elements, you're kind of making things a bit more your own, I think, even if you're using presets or stuff you have already. Creating drum hits, for what it's worth, creating drum hit samples from scratch, as in not just recording a drum machine or something like that. Creating drum hits from scratch by layering elements up and using drum synthesis is a pain. So making a good snare from scratch is, yeah, I've tried, and I ended up with a library of samples, which you can get if you're one of my patrons. If you go to my Patreon page and join as a producer, I have a ton of original drum hits which you can download for free and use in whatever you fancy. That's the smoothest plug I think I've ever done. But yeah, creating those from scratch is a complete pain, and I don't recommend doing it unless you're really, really into creating your own sounds. Like a nice weight. Snares are the thing I always struggle with. Kicks, no problem. Don't have a problem with creating kicks. So yeah. The player guy says, can you give me some feedback? I can if you join my Patreon as a producer. I provide feedback once per month on the tune of your choosing. If you send it over to me, I will give you some feedback and tell you what I think. But that is a Patreon perk. I don't tend to give feedback on things just generally, because, especially not live on stream, because I have no idea what I'm going to be listening to, and I feel like I prefer to give it the personal touch if I can. So with that in mind, I'm going to move on to Pulling the Thread, which is the third and final track from this session. So I'm just going to play that from start to finish and keep quiet and then talk about what I changed. So here we go. I'm just going to play it now. So yeah, that was Pulling the Thread. I think out of the most recent tracks I've done, that is absolutely one of my favorites. There's something, not to take away from the other tracks, but there's something about that that it's something that it's very expressive. I guess it's something that kind of I really really like. I'm very happy with kind of the technicality and the flow of Chiroptera, and I'm really really happy with how Liminal Sequence panned out. It's just one of those things. It's, you know, your favorites kind of just pop out and develop over time. But No Sonic Limit said it just got reminded of Pieces. Sounds really really good. So for anyone unaware, Pieces is an album I released in 2014. And yeah, I can totally see that. It does have that kind of vibe to it, which is really, really, really neat. Tony Burns said, that bass. Yeah, so the bass was provided by VK2. So this is actually a really good example of creating a sound on the fly that I thought would sit nicely. And it's just using techniques that it's kind of like my standard VK2 bass at this point. I just, you know, have a particular sort of setup that I tend to go towards when I want that kind of bass. And VK2 is just really, really good at providing it. Digical says, always love your percussion, Adam. Thanks. I'm glad you like it. In this particular track, generally speaking, my drum samples tend to come from the Evolve free library, which is on the Wave Alchemy website. So if you want some really good drum samples just ready to go to the Wave Alchemy site and get their Evolve free sample pack. It's really really good. Definitely worth checking out. I've been using those for pretty much all of my streams except for one or two where I've used factory soundbank patches instead. They're just really good and just sound great out of the box, and it's nice to kind of have that a bit more of a restricted palette if you just want to grab some good sounds. The full version of Drumvolution does include a lot more drums, and they're all generally really really good. That has kind of become my go-to one-shot drum sample library for all of my solo stuff if I'm not using acoustic drums. So Clubmutt said, another lush breakdown. Thank you. Yeah, I really like that. I didn't extend that one. I think I learned my lesson from the week before and just let that kind of ride out a bit longer. I really like that antidote pad that I used in there as well. I think that's quite an old patch, I think, but I really like the sound of that. Yeah. So yeah, I really like how that turned out. So for anyone who actually missed the stream, again, this was kind of, I did a very similar thing in terms of the sort of approach to blocks as I did in Liminal Sequence. In fact, I think both tracks started in a very similar way. So I created block one, which is, I'll just play block one. So when I first started, I think I've spent about 40 minutes creating this one block, which kind of became the backbone of most of the track. So when I started this track, I actually started before the stream with this little key pattern. So that was a Europa patch that I'd created earlier in the day, and I just really, really liked how it sounded. So I thought it'd be a nice idea to have something ready to go for the stream because I hadn't done anything the week before. So I thought it'd be nice to be able to hit the ground running and have something to work around. Fiery Biscuits has asked, what was the advice you had about Drumvolution once? Something about which format to go for. So there's a Contact version, which is really, really good, but you have to use Contact to use it. And there's also the, I think it's called the Ableton Live pack version or something, which basically includes a bunch of Ableton Live rack devices that you can use in the native to Ableton Live, but it also includes all of the one-shot samples as separate audio files, so you can use them in whatever you want, which I really like. I really like the Contact version, and it's great to just be able to drop in an instance of Contact and have some extra processing ready to go. But I do prefer to just drop samples into the drum machines that I want to use. So, and also I think the Ableton Live version is cheaper as well, but they're both really, really good. You can't really go wrong. But yeah, Drumvolution, the actual sort of drum samples in Drumvolution, the kind of meat of it is fantastic. It just means if you're not using the Contact version, you can't use the built-in sequencer or any of the built-in effects or the drum designer stuff. You have to do it all manually, which is kind of a pain if you want to make use of the sort of drum elements like individual transients and stuff like that. But personally, I tend to I used the Contact version all over a production album I did last year and used it exclusively pretty much all of my drum sounds on that, and I loved it. But now I tend to use the audio files separately just because I quite like that as well. I like choice basically. But yeah, they're really good. So yeah, so that was this simple keys patch I created. So it's not particularly complex. I mean, I'm using all three engines, and it kind of follows the same sort of individual layer approach that a lot of my Europa patches follow. So each layer is kind of a distinct sound, and they all come together to form a sort of nice rounded sound. But yeah, so I decided to do that at the start, and then I built this block around that. So this is the entirety of the block which became the tune, really. And again, block 2 is pretty much a variation on that. I just varied the chord progression, so I'll just play that. So I can't stress enough how incredibly useful it is during a stream just to be able to have those blocks done already, so I know where the track is going to go. And again, with block 3, I just took block 2 essentially and just had a steady chord playing throughout instead of varying things up, so it was quite simple. So yeah, so having that kind of destination in mind before I actually started arranging the track was so incredibly useful. Tom has asked me, are there any DAWs that you are using besides Reason? Why? Question for all. It's a good question. I tend to use Studio One for if I'm mastering entire projects. And the reason I do that is because Studio One has a really cool project view, which is geared specifically towards doing that. And unfortunately, there's just nothing like it in Reason, really. Outside of that, I tend to use Reason for everything nowadays. I used to use a bit of Cubase and a bit of Studio One when I had to bounce VSTs out and bring them into Reason as audio, or when I used to use Rewire with Cubase. But nowadays, it's really one of the things I've really liked about Reason's sort of progression over the past decade or so is the fact that now I don't really have to use anything else, which is pretty much all I wanted from day one, was to be able to do everything in Reason. Bringing in VST support was a game changer for me because it meant that I could pretty much do everything in Reason from that point onwards. But like I said, the only thing I tend to use Studio One for now is mastering complete projects. Just because it's really good for that, and it's just a completely different environment. But yeah, it's fantastic. So I had the blocks ready to go. In terms of what I actually changed in this track the day after, again, I kind of adjusted the levels and kind of brought everything up so it was sort of, the loudness was kind of on par with the rest of the tracks that I've been doing during these live streams. Again, I kind of used a similar trick to just bringing up the levels to where the limiter was just kicking in, and then gave it a bit of a bump on the output. So not too much limiting, but just kind of enough to bring it up to a more sort of commercial standard, I guess. So I added a bass fade in around bar 74. So if I play it here, originally that bass came in much stronger, and it was a bit jarring, especially after that lovely extended breakdown. So yeah, I really like that bass sound. I just like this. I love the sound of VK2 with those kind of nice sort of filter sweeps. It's very nice. Clubmas asks, is there a particular loudness maybe in LUFS that you're aiming for? So that's actually a really good question. And I don't do this so much during these live streams, but I do actually own Julian's loudness meter, which is fantastic for this kind of thing. I tend to use it as an offline tool. So basically there's two ways of using this. This is basically a really cool meter. You feed audio into it and it kind of gives you various measurements for what's going into it. which is great to kind of get a more technical perspective. Generally speaking, I like to use my ears, but you can't use your ears all the time if you're targeting a particular platform like YouTube or Spotify or whatever. It makes sense to have a rough idea of if you're hitting their particular targets. So you can use it as a VST, and you just feed audio into it, and it gives you a sort of rough value. So if I disable the limiter there and actually leave that open, if I just play a bit of the track, it should give you a rough LUFS value. So I'll just play that from here. So that's around -17, which is typically what I would aim for if I was working on a track like this using Julian loudness meters. So that's actually really, really good. So yeah, I do have various targets for specific things. So I might target a specific LUFS value post limiting or post mastering or whatever like that. Digicolors asks, do you master your releases yourself? It depends entirely on the release. If it's one of my independent releases, I tend to do it myself, just because I'm very much of the opinion that you should get your mix sounding as good as possible before you get to the mastering stage. And I tend to do that, so it means I can't really go wrong at the mastering stage. I could just give everything a bit of a bump or just a slight tweak, run it through the analog heat if I want to, just a bit of saturation. So I have some sort of processes and approaches that I use, but it's really interesting. I was talking to a friend about this recently, and he said that one of the main things he really likes about having someone else master his music is that it gives him an extra pair of ears, essentially. And the important thing to remember is if you're getting someone else to master your music, they're going to be approaching it from a completely objective perspective. They're going to be mastering it how they, would want it to sound. Like, obviously, you can provide your own input, but they will have a clear idea of what they want to do with it. So I think it's a bit of both. But if I'm releasing music through a label or if I'm releasing production music, then I tend to let someone else handle it because why not? But with my own independent stuff, I tend to just do it myself, and it's so far it's served me well, and I've been happy with kind of what I've been putting out. I've had a few people ask me if I could master their stuff, which has always been nice. But I'm by no means a mastering engineer, so I'm not sort of into that dark art. I like I said, I feel like I have a good idea of how I want to master my stuff, basically. So yeah, there we go. It's a nice little tangent there. So yes, Julian loudness meter is really good. I use that quite a bit nowadays, just to kind of give me a rough idea. But you can use it as a VST, or you can use it as a separate application. And I prefer using it as a standalone application because with the application, you can just feed entire audio files into it instead of having to play the entirety of your tune into it to get a LUFS value. It's useful if you're working on a track and you want a quick idea of kind of where it's at. But for actual sort of post mix processing, I tend to use it as a completely offline process. So I'll just get rid of that for now. But yeah, that's really, really good. I think it was on sale recently as well. So if it's still on sale, I'd recommend it. I don't know if it is anymore though. Just sort of pop up in my feed a couple of times. So what did I change here besides the bass fade in? I didn't actually change a lot in this track. One of the main things I changed was the drop kick. So this was kind of a late addition in the track, and I'm just going to solo that and play that particular thing there. Actually, I'll just leave that. So yeah, this is a sort of drop kick thing that I added quite late into the process, after I'd finished most of the track really, and it sounds like this. And originally it didn't sound like that. I used a completely different kick drum sample and it just wasn't doing it for me the following day. So I messed around with it and I just couldn't get a sound that I was happy with. So I just kind of went back to the source, changed the kick sample, and job was a good one. I also added a maximizer just to kind of make sure that it wasn't completely overwhelming the mix. I think that just kicks in during the transient, and also added a whole bunch of soft clipping. So you can't really tell that it's doing a lot. It just makes things a bit easier for me on the output. That means there's plenty of headroom at the post-mix stage. So yeah, that was really neat to be able to bust out the old reverse reverb on the RV7000 as well for a change. So you get that nice tail leading into it. Tom says, sorry for the question. Don't have to be sorry for asking me stuff. That's what I'm here for. Appreciate it. When you're mastering it in Studio One, you are mastering it with exported WAVs from Reason without any effect in Reason. Yes, essentially. So I will just take the bounce out of Reason. Whoa, damn, there's some crazy feedback going on there. So I'll literally just take the bounced version out of Reason without any maximizer or anything like that. I'm generally pretty careful with my levels, so there's normally already a decent amount of headroom. I'll just bring that straight into Studio One, where I will do all my mastering fun. So yeah, no mastering no post-mix processing when it goes into Studio One, unless I've already processed it using the analog heap, but that's its own separate process anyway. So yeah, I also added a DR1 after. Originally, so this dropkick was, I had the reverb, sort of the kind of swooshy reverb that comes before the dropkick after the DR1 originally, and that sounded kind of weird. So I held down Shift and did the trusty Shift drag above. If you hold down Shift in Reason, if you're unaware, and you drag anything around, it will recable things automatically, which is incredibly useful. And I still maintain it should be the default. You should have the choice of having it as default behavior or not. So hold down Shift to not rewire stuff, as opposed to holding down Shift to automatically do it. But that's just me. That's a topic for another time. So yeah, I changed the drop kick. I also added later in the track. I didn't change the arrangement at all. That remained completely intact from the stream itself. But later in the track, I added some octaves on the pad because I felt like this section here, it just needed a bit of extra kind of oomph. So if I just solo the pad, it just needed like an extra element. And I think kind of adding that extra octave on top just kind of gave it a slight little push without muddying up the mix. Tyblo has asked me, and do you mix this version as opposed to bouncing stems and mixing them? So what I tend to do is I'll continue to mix everything in Reason. I'll do all my mixing in Reason. I'll get it to where I'm happy with it before applying any post-mix effects. So it'll go through several iterations where I'll be bouncing it constantly from Reason and making mix adjustments, bouncing, listening, until I'm at a place where I'm happy with it and it sounds good to me even without any mastering applied. And then it will just go through sort of a final mastering pass just to bring out some extra, just to kind of make them best of what it is at the moment, really. So I like it to sound as good as it can possibly be at every stage of the process. So when it gets to the mastering stage, I don't have to make any crazy corrective tweaks or anything like that. It's very, like I've said before, it's very easy to break a good mix at the mastering stage by trying to apply all kinds of corrective effects, whereas you could just do that in the mix and it's so much easier. So that was just like a nice little touch there with the pad. So I also added a MP5 and I used that to kind of apply a 300 hertz dip because originally it was kind of ringing quite a bit, which I didn't really notice at the time, but afterwards I listened back to it and I was like, there's a bit of a spike there. So I just kind of used the MP5 to just kind of take that out and it sounded great. And I also used it to give it a bit of a boost around 12k, quite a boost actually, just to kind of give it a bit of sizzle. That didn't actually affect the sound as much as you think it would, but I liked what it did, so it just adds a bit more of that kind of staticky sound. And I did a very similar thing so in the track there's this grain texture which kind of pops up from time to time, so I'm just going to solo that. It sounds like this. I find it helps if I don't include the filter. Actually, I'll just play this at the start. So it's kind of a nice sound, but originally I didn't have this MP5 applied, so I'm just going to bypass it now. And it just sounded kind of unpleasant, sort of around 500 hertz or so. So again, I did the exact same thing, just stuck an MP5 on, set it to 500 hertz, and just scooped that out a bit. And Epilogue Sound has just asked me, do you ever use the Spectrum EQ? I don't tend to use it very often nowadays. I tend to find, if I want to find a problem frequency, I'll just do the whole create an instance of the M-Class EQ and just increase the Q so it's as narrow a band as possible and just sweep through until the problem frequency really hits me. And then I'll either use the M-Class EQ to just bring it down, or I'll use something else like the MP5. But I don't tend to use the spectral EQ. I'm not really sure why. I think, yeah, I feel like generally speaking, by the time I get to that stage, I like to do most of my mixing in the rack if possible. So I don't tend to need to make that many tweaks EQ-wise in the mixer outside of filtering and stuff like that. But that's just a personal preference. So Tom has asked, so if I get it right, there is a bounce mixer channel. That's where it goes exported to WAVs. Yeah, so if you go to File, Bounce Mixer Channels, you can select which mixer channels you want to bounce. In my instance, I tend to just check all and bounce everything. And the one I'll be using for mastering is the master section. But then it means I've also got all the stems. If I ever need to revisit the track and I can't open any synths or anything like that, I can just use the stems. So it's like a really nice way of archiving everything. And because I'm using inserts again, it means everything's baked in. I can just dip in, grab whatever I need, and it's great. What I tend to do is after I've bounced stems, I tend to convert them to Flack format. So that massively crunches down the size, because a lot of those stems are just going to be just silence basically, because not everything is playing all of the time, and that can drastically reduce the size. So for archiving purposes, I'll just Flack them and stick them on a drive somewhere. So yeah, I've got quite a comprehensive selection of stems at this point. And again, if you decide to become a patron, and if you look on my Patreon page and decide to become a producer, you get access to all of my live stream stems, which is nice. So yeah, if you're missing an instrument or something and you want to mess around with it yourself, you can just grab the audio stems and bring them into your DAW of choice and have at it. So yeah, that's literally all I changed in that track. Was I changed the drop kick, made a couple of fade tweaks, tweaked a couple of levels and stuff like that, and that was basically it. I didn't make any sweeping changes like some of the other tracks. That was a very, very kind of minimal affair on my part. So yeah, and it was also nice to see the nasal riser returning. Bless it. Also, I realized as well while I was playing the track, I forgot. I was thinking, oh, that sort of arpeggiated synth sounds really, really nice. I wonder what I used for that. And of course, it's the Tom Pritchard sound design ARP, because of course it is, because it sounded really good. I just completely forgot that I'd used that particular patch in this tune. So if I just play that. It's just a really nice sound. I feel like it kind of complements the rest of the mix really well. And there's, again, I didn't do a huge amount to it, just added a bit of reverb and delay. So just because I wanted to use the DR1 again. So yes. Tony Bone says, less an issue with Reason, but I live in fear of the day where DAW projects won't open anymore in a DAW, so I tend to bounce tracks pre and after mixing, keep both sets. A single track can easily eat 1 to 2 gigs of disk space. Yes, that's a real problem, and that actually put me off bouncing stems for many, many years. That and the fact that the aforementioned using aux ends kind of made them a bit, was it really necessary to do that? And also the fact that up until recently, Reason didn't have any kind of plugin support, so it always opened everything without problems, as long as you had the samples required. But what really encouraged me to start bouncing stems of everything I was working on was the introduction of VSTs, because I realized, what if I update a VST and I can't get the same sound out of it, or it's incompatible with my old project, which had happened before with some stuff I'd worked on in Cubase. So I decided I wanted to future-proof absolutely everything, and that's why I now bounce stems for everything I work on and then Flack them. So typically speaking, after I've flacked everything, that will a single track takes up a couple of 100 megabytes, I think, which I feel like it's a small price to pay in terms of storage for future-proofing everything. And if you're using macOS, you can actually import Flacks directly into Reason, but for some reason Windows doesn't let you do that, which is very odd. That's actually part of the reason why I decided to use Flacks in the first place. But then I moved to Windows and realized that Reason can't open Flacks, which is very strange. So if anyone has a workaround for that, please let me know, because I'm very curious. But it means that if I want to use stems nowadays, I just have to convert them to WAV files, which is a piece of cake if I'm using something like Foobar. So yeah, that is one thing I really like about sort of older, well, just Reason in general, is the fact that I could open up a tune written using Reason 1 and it would open up pretty much perfectly and sound pretty much exactly the same as it did when it was written in Reason 1. So yeah, the backwards compatibility in Reason is pretty fantastic. So does Digical says, does Flack affect quality at all? It doesn't. It's a completely lossless format, so otherwise I wouldn't use it. No, it's the audio remains exactly the same. It just uses up a lot less space, a lot less space. Even if most of your stems aren't silenced, like mine tend to be, it can still crunch the size of the track down to about half of what it was originally. So my entire music library on this computer is in FLAC format, so it's all lossless because I like listening to lossless audio when I have the choice. So yeah, cool. So yeah, that's all the tracks that I've been doing recently, and next week I'll be writing another track from scratch. Be back to the old music making sessions. And yeah, but yeah, it's always nice to kind of go over these old, not so old tracks, go over these tracks and kind of think about what would I have changed, or you know, what did I actually change, that kind of thing. So in terms of this track, I don't think I would change a thing, but in terms of, again, it's interesting. I feel like with these tracks I wouldn't really change a lot actually, even if I were to write them again. Like I think these three tracks are some of my own favorites as well, so it's really nice that people have kind of been saying that. Fusion 9903 says full ambient track next stream. So I do have some ideas about that. I would actually really like to do an ambient track at some point in a future stream. I don't know if it'll be the next one, but I do have some interesting ideas about that one. It depends on if I can get a few things working. But I'm not going to tease you about that until I know I can actually do it. But there is I released a collection of ambient tracks earlier this year called Aphelion, which it's available in the vault if you're a patron. I'm going to stop shilling my Patreon page, I swear. But yeah, it's part of what's called the vault. If you're a Bandcamp subscriber or if you're a patron, you get access to loads of extra material, which I've not released publicly otherwise. And Aphelion is one of those. And it's an album of ambient tracks created using samples taken from a session with a Lyra 8 synth. And I really like how it turned out, but it's kind of, yeah. So I'm thinking it might be fun to do something like that in a future stream. But we will see. We'll see. So yeah, anyway, I'm going to leave this session here. If you're watching on Twitch, stick around afterwards. I'll be sticking around for a few minutes just to take some questions and generally chill out with everyone in the chat. But if you're watching on YouTube, then that's the end of this session. And thank you so much for joining me. It's been great to go over these tracks again, and I'm looking forward to writing something again next week for you. So yeah, as always, take it easy and hope you have a great weekend. Cheers and bye-bye.